Philip Giraldi is a former counterterrorism specialist and military intelligence officer for the CIA. He served 18 years with the company in Turkey, Italy, Germany, and Spain. He speaks all 4 languages. Philip is executive director of the Council for the National Interest, a group that advocates for more even-handed U.S. government policies in the Middle East. He is president of San Marco International, an international security management and risk assessment consulting firm, and a partner in Canestraro Associates, another security consultancy. Philip has written columns on terrorism, intelligence, and security issues for the American Conservative, Huffington Post, and antiwar.com. He's been on Good Morning America, 60 Minutes, MSNBC, Fox News, NPR, BBC, CBC, Al Jazeera, and Al Arabiya, to name just a few. During the 2008 presidential primaries, Philip served as a foreign policy advisor to the Patriot Congressman, Dr. Ron Paul. Philip Giraldi, welcome to the Global Freedom Report.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you. I'd like to ask you first, just out of curiosity, what was it like working so directly with Ron Paul on his presidential campaign?
Well, the campaign was basically a grassroots campaign, and that essentially meant that it was somewhat more disorganized than one would expect from a centrally focused campaign that most of the other candidates were running. But it also meant that a lot of ideas were surfacing, and it was constantly, shall we say, very interesting.
Well, it raises a question for me. Now, you spent 18 years with the CIA in 4 different countries. I'm curious how your time with the agency has affected your political views. For example, did you find yourself giving Dr. Paul advice that was consistent with your actions and beliefs as a CIA agent for 18 years? Or did your work for the company prompt you to change your views on foreign policy by the time you became involved with his campaign? How has it been for you since when you started working for the agency to today? What kind of changes in your political views have taken place?
Well, I think the fair way to answer that is that when I started out with the CIA, obviously there was a Soviet Union, which was an international threat in many terms against the United States and against many of the people in Europe, and it was perceived that way. By the time I left the CIA, it was quite a different world, and I particularly became disenchanted with the concept of the U.S. government being a benign force in the world in the wake of 9/11. I was at CIA for the year 2002, 2003, and I saw how the intelligence was being manipulated to go to war with Iraq. And it was very disconcerting for me. It was very upsetting for me. And subsequently, under the Bush administration in particular, I saw a lot of manipulation of intelligence, a lot of lying basically about what America's role had to be in terms of countering terrorism and other issues. So in effect, I became a critic of what was coming out of the White House and what was coming out of the intelligence community. And basically for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been critical also of the efforts of Mr. Obama. And essentially I feel that the United States is going down a road that it should not be going down in terms of our own civil liberties and also in terms of our interaction with the rest of the world.
Now, presumably, you're not the only person who's ever worked for the Central Intelligence Agency who has those types of feelings. So how is it that people who think that we're going down the wrong road, so to speak, how there isn't a sufficient amount of influence to offset that tendency to push us somewhere we don't want to go? I mean, what has happened to people like you in the company standing up and saying, hey, wait a moment, we're going the wrong way. We need to go somewhere else?
The simple answer is when you're inside the government, you can't really do that. But it's also true that a number of former intelligence officers like myself have been speaking up, and I would cite the examples of Ray McGovern and the Christensens and Bob Baer, people all of whom have been saying that the policy, and Michael Schur, all of whom have been saying that the policy is misguided. So, but as to why what we say has not had the impact that you might expect, I think the answer is very simple. There is a lot of money tied up in terms of how the war on terror and how the international posture of the United States is exercised. And I think we're talking about a lot of people have a vested interest in the status quo, and even if they have doubts, they don't question it.
Over the last few weeks, we've seen what appear to be popular uprisings in Tunisia, Yemen, Algeria, Albania, Serbia, Iraq, and of course Egypt. And now there is talk of a Bahraini uprising and possibly one in Kyrgyzstan. What opinions have you formed concerning the cause of so many protest movements occurring in one relative region of the world all at the same time? Is it a planned series of events, and if so, planned by whom?
Well, I don't think it's planned. I think it's basically spontaneous. I think that the countries that you just named are basically countries that have had oppressive governments of one kind or another, and that the situation starting in Tunisia set off a spark that a lot of people have been copying. Now, you can look at these situations and you can criticize them on a lot of levels, and you should legitimately be concerned about what might come out of them. But the fact is that, as we Americans discovered in 1776, an oppressive government basically eventually will produce a response among the citizens, or among at least the people that live in the country. They may not view themselves as citizens. And essentially that, ultimately there will be a response that will, bring people out into the streets. It happened at Lexington and Concord, and it's happening in a number of other countries. It's something that, I'm not quite sure if we should welcome it in a sense. It's something though that we should, I think, respect.
So you don't think the fact that, in other words, it's not happening in Europe, where some of the countries are having their share of economic protests, but no real uprisings or anything. It's not happening in Asia. You don't think that the consolidation of these various countries all in the same basic region of the world, you don't think that is anything but coincidence?
Well, I'm not saying coincidence exactly. I'm just saying that why it doesn't happen in most countries in Asia and also in Europe is because people believe that they have a functioning government system where their vote counts and where they can change governments if the government becomes too oppressive. What we're looking at is Eastern Europe, parts of Eastern Europe, and parts of the Middle East and parts of Central Asia, where the governments have basically been repressive. And I think that this is a natural reaction among people to want to have some say in how they're governed. And no, I don't see it as anything beyond that. But I'm willing to be convinced. I do, as a former intelligence officer, I understand that it's quite possible in many situations for situations to be manipulated. And whether we're seeing that here is something we may find out. But I think in this case, what we're seeing, at least now, is a spontaneous popular eruption against corrupt government. And
in fairness, it's perfectly possible that that's the case, and I'm just watching too much television or something of that sort.
Could be.
There we go. Recently, you wrote an article entitled "The Road to National Suicide," in which you state that in conflicts such as the one in which we are engaged in Afghanistan, the militants always have the upper hand. Why is that the case?
Well, there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, the Afghan people, I think it's pretty clear, see us as invaders. And in that kind of situation, the local people will generally gather around people that they see as their local people who are resisting the invasion. And I think that there are a number of other dynamics in terms of what's going on there that favor the insurgency, if we want to call it the insurgency. For example, they're a whole lot more adaptive than we are in terms of fitting their tactics to hit the weak points of the heavily armed and heavily equipped and slow moving soldiers from the West. And they also have advantages in terms of being able to react to situations politically in much more positive ways than the United States and its allies can do. So it becomes a situation where the enemy kind of melts away and then comes back, and the enemy is not something that's susceptible to being bombed or attacked with tanks or anything like that, because it's not that kind of enemy. We're not fighting a national government. We're not fighting a conventional army. So I think basically that the situation is in places like Afghanistan unwinnable.
Isn't this another way of saying that in a guerrilla war, the guerrillas have never lost?
I think it is. Before I came on the air, I was thinking to myself, I said, if they ask me that question, can I come up with a guerrilla war where the guerrillas have lost? I think the only one that's ever cited is in Malaysia with the British shortly after the Second World War. But there was a different element to that. It was a communist insurgency. It wasn't a nationalist insurgency, and it played out in a different way. So I think your question is quite right, and I think it's to the point that there never has been a guerrilla insurgency that the conventional forces in the long run have won.
Well, and it seems to me that any time you're going to engage in preemptive intervention, to be nice, that you're going to encourage a guerrilla war, because that's the only way you can fight some kind of a massive army like the U.S. Considering the U.S. official policy of preemptive interventionism continues to birth anti-American guerrilla movements wherever America intrudes, isn't the government simply setting the stage for an endless stream of military losses? Should the U.S. just get out of foreign countries and bring our troops home and say that's that?
Yeah, well, that's the Ron Paul line, essentially, that the United States is engaged in a series of wars and interventions and has built up a huge military base structure overseas to support these wars and interventions, and that all of this stuff is essentially unwinnable. And I think that's what I believe. I think I would call myself a realist, and I would say that there are times you're going to have to fight wars, and there are times you have to use your military capability to avert threats against you. But, these wars are not that. These countries don't threaten us. They don't, you might say, all right, if they harbor a terrorist or a terrorist group, that terrorist group might attack you, but that doesn't threaten your future or your integrity as a country. So all of this stuff has been much overblown. The whole terrorism threat, I think, is overblown. And the result of this is we're fighting wars that we cannot win, and that we're bankrupting ourselves to fight. So it's a terrible prospect. And many of us, I think, had hoped that when Obama came in, that there would be a shift in these kinds of policies. But if anything, it's worse now than it was.